This is KM Weiland, and you are listening to the 530th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. Welcome to 2021 and this year's first podcast episode. As you may have noticed, this is also the first podcast in over a month. And that's because instead of the usual Monday posts/podcasts, I took a bit of a break in December. I did still share my usual roundup of year's end posts, though, which included a list of the top books I read in 2020, as well as a list of the top posts on the site during the past year, just in case you want to check if you missed any. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, 7 Writing Lessons Learned in 2020. For me, the turning of the year is certainly a time of examining habits, renewing intentions, and creating plans. But more than setting goals for the coming year, I prefer to think about the lessons I have learned from the year that has passed. In my experience, goals all but just happen when their required foundations are in place. When that foundation is lacking, then even a great amount of energy and application cannot achieve the desired result. And so, when the new year rolls around, I like to look back at the foundations that have been laid in the past 12 months. What has the year taught me, and how can I build on what I have been given? This past year was a year like no other. This is clearly true on a global level, and I dare say it is true for each of us in small and subjective ways. Certainly it has been true for me. Aside from all the big impacts to the world out there, my own year, and particularly my year as a writer, has also been a year like no other. Even in comparison to other recent years, it was a year that deeply challenged almost all the beliefs and identities I have carried around my writing. It was not a year of deep productivity in an external sense. It was probably the year in which I wrote less fiction than I ever have since my preteen years. Largely due to this, it was an unsettling year for me as a writer, and it has made me ask questions and face fears. In many ways, for obvious reasons, 2020 was one of the hardest years ever. But also in many ways, for me personally, I am surprised that it has given me some of the greatest gifts I have ever received. So today, I would like to share 7 of the writing lessons I feel I learned, or at least started learning, in 2020, in hopes that they will inspire, ground, and encourage you in contemplating your own foundation for moving forward into the wide new frontier of 2021. Lesson number 1, don't be so serious, or play more. Walt Kelly, the cartoonist, was quoted as saying, "Don't take life so serious. It ain't no-how permanent." So when did writing become such super serious business? I look back on general advice I internalized as a young writer starting out, and while I recognize that it helped me build a career, I also realized that such gems as the following also created a pretty grim outlook, such as treat writing like a job, or if you don't take your writing seriously, no one else will either, or if writing doesn't pay, it's not worth doing. Or if you aren't writing something readers will love, you're not a real writer. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a measure of truth and value in those statements, but where's the fun? Where's the joy of creation for creation's sake? After all, storytelling is an inherently childlike act. Entertainment is all about having fun. Mostly, I recognize that this super serious outlook has less to do with my writing and more to do with me as a grown-up human grappling with what, admittedly, seems a pretty serious world. In this year, when I wrote almost no fiction, I have realized that if my writing doesn't seem as much fun as it used to, it's because the act of telling stories has grown separate from the simple joy of creation that prompted it when I was young. And so, I plan to play more in 2021. More artists date with my inner child, such as Julia Cameron suggests in her book, The Artist's Way. No more sitting at the desk and demanding I write something about which I have little enthusiasm. No more self-flagellation for not writing. Writing, as we all know deep down, is far more about not writing than it is the actual writing. Lesson number 2, remember why you're here, or how it all started. So this brings me back to the reason I started writing in the first place. What was yours? Do you remember? I think I rather lost mine for a while amidst all the very serious work of becoming a capital letter writer. But here's my reason. Here's why I'm here talking to you, recording this podcast every week. Here's why I've spent the better part of my life typing away at the keyboard, why I've published 5 novels, and why any of this matters to me at all. I didn't start out as a writer. I started out as a kid who loved to tell and play stories. At a certain point, I decided I would write one down because I loved it and its characters so much that I didn't ever want to forget it. So I started writing because of the way it made me feel. Like there was an infinite world of possibilities out there. In short, I don't write because I'm a writer, or even because I love writing, although I do. I write because I love my stories so much, I want never to forget them. So maybe I will never find that same childlike passion again. Maybe adults must write for other reasons. But I don't really believe that. At any rate, I'm committed to giving myself a chance to find that again, to find another story I love so much I must write it down, if only so I will never forget it. In practicality, I think there are 2 steps to this. 1, I must learn to listen again. And 2, I must be willing not to write, not to keep flogging the brain. I think that is perhaps the scariest thing of all. Indeed, even as I say this, there's a part of me that isn't sure I can consciously commit to not at least trying to write for a while. But the very fact that it scares the spit out of me tells me it's probably exactly the right step forward. Lesson number 3, find your inspiration. Or, what do you want to say? I've spent a lot of time in the dream zone so far this winter, trying to see if there is a story ready for me to write. What I've realized is that part of what I'm searching for is something new to say. I used to believe we each have one story to tell and we just go on telling it in different ways all our lives. And I still think there's truth to that, but I'm also coming to realize that perhaps I have finished telling the story I was given to tell in the first act of my life. Now, as I enter the second act, I am a different person. Much as I love the early stories, they are stories that belong to my younger self, not the me that now is. And this is both frightening and exciting since I don't yet know what story I have to tell in this new chapter of my life. I know I have things to say. I can feel them all bursting inside of me. I just don't know what they are yet. This too goes back to listening. I often think of Jo March's statement in the 1994 adaptation of Little Women, where she says, "I want to do something different. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm on the watch for it." I foretell that one of the greatest challenges of this coming year will be, for me, sitting still, keeping my mouth shut, listening, and waiting. What is it I want to say in a new story? I don't know yet, but I've always believed that if you know the question, you know the answer. At least I have the question now. Lesson number 4, keep perspective, or writing was always hard. Somewhere within the last few years, I got this unspoken, mostly subconscious idea that writing wasn't supposed to be hard. Sure, it required discipline, but agony, doubt, wasted hours, writer's block, nah. It just so happened 2020 was the year in which I decided to reread all my old journals, starting from when I was 13. It is a chronicle of all my writing years. And mostly, it's a chronicle of how hard writing has always been. I started and failed on so many more stories than I remembered. I took long breaks in between finished novels because I had no idea what to write. In short, none of this is new. it's been a welcome, humbling, and slightly humorous return to perspective. One of the great values in writing a journal or a blog is that we can return to remember insights from our former selves, which we may have lost track of. So this year, I will continue journaling, and I will continue reading my old journals as letters from my much wiser younger self to my sometimes short-sighted current self. Lesson number 5, nothing is ever wasted, or unexpected gifts. Like so many of us in our fast-moving society, I have a tendency to judge the value of my time based on what I accomplished. To finish a year without moving the needle on a work in progress is frustrating. But aside from the unseen productivity of lessons learned, I can also see how true it is that nothing is ever wasted. I didn't break through my writer's block this year or finish my outline. But then I remembered that in wrangling with that writer's block this year and trying to figure out how to fix my story, I spent a great deal of time learning about and working with archetypal character arcs. I may not have gotten what I wanted, a Scrivener file full of outline notes for a novel, but I did get a Scrivener file full of outline notes for a new blog series that will perhaps eventually become a book in its own right. And you can stay tuned for more on that in the upcoming weeks. Really, this is exactly why I rather dislike goals. They tend to fixate us, me anyway, too much on one specific outcome. And if we don't achieve that outcome, well, then what's the point? What is true, I think, is that when we show up at the desk and put in the work, something always happens. It may not be what we expected. It may not even be tangible. But nothing is ever wasted. Lesson number 6. Being a writer doesn't always mean writing. Or word count, schmurd count. Speaking of narrow perspectives, it has come home to me more this year than any year that I have an extremely narrow definition of what it means to be a writer. When I talk about my writing or writing time, I am always talking about writing fiction. Only fiction, and only writing, i.e. not organizing notes, not daydreaming, not proofreading. This was something the pandemic helped me recognize pretty early on last year when I wrote the episode 15 Productive Tasks You Can Still Do Even When You Don't Feel Like Writing. More than that, I've realized how my fiction block these last few years has rather led me to discount the fact that I have been steadily writing all along, every week on the blog. And indeed, that I did publish a book this year, my writing craft guide, Writing Your Stories theme. I have been so identified as a writer for so long that any threat to that identity is disturbing. But even more than realizing that I can be a writer in many different ways, I realize I must also be willing to broaden my definition of myself. I am not a writer. Writing is just one of many ways in which I express myself and my creativity. And lesson number 7, be present, or you can't repeat the past or plan the future. If there's one thing 2020 has taught us, it is that everything can change by the time you get to the end of the toilet paper roll. 2020 was what I think of as a shatter point. The world will never go back to the way it was before. Ironically, this proof of how irrevocably we are always divided from the past makes it more obvious that we cannot ever truly rely on future plans. This offers a great deal of significance in so many areas of life. But in regards to my own struggles as a writer this year, it offers the reminder that the only thing I can do is be present. However much I may wish it, I can never return to or truly repeat the magic of my childhood relationship to stories. Nor can I decide what my future as a writer will be and demand that my creativity follow suit. I can only be present with what is and try to be as honest as possible in my perception of it. Really, this is about relinquishing control, letting go of the past and letting go of the future. I am totally positive I will not master that one this year. But in between the grief of letting go of the way things used to be and the yearning that the future should be all that we wish it, there is a center poised of peace to be found here in the present. As Julian of Norwich says, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. So, I hope you will stop by the site and tell me your opinion. What lessons did you learn as a writer from the adventures of 2020? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.